Hello, everyone. I'm Jane Albright. I am particularly happy to read this story in our 50 Years, 50 Stories celebration of Oziana because I wrote it. It was from the 1994 issue of Oziana. And as Robin Olderman mentions in her editor's introductory essay, the Billy Bumble of Oz is actually based on the real Billy Bumble, our friend Bill Eubank. I knew Bill from attending Oz conventions for years where he performed as a clown, he performed as a puppeteer. He was a wonderful illustrator. He had this fun way of entertaining us by having you write your initials on a piece of paper and he'd draw around them and turn them into a bumblebee. So there were a lot of little things that you'll see in here that were references to the real Billy Bumble. And I also wanted to say that I named Mary Jane from the story after Laura Jane Mueller and Mary Scott, who were both Oz Club members who attended those early conventions with me back in Castle Park as well. Mary Scott always wore her Ozmite pin to our conventions that had been around since the 1920s when she had been a member of that organization. But anyway, so that's the origins of the name Billy Bumble, the character of Billy Bumble, and where Mary Jane came from. So here we go. Let's read this. Eric Shanauer illustrated it for me, which is always a thrill. Billy Harris was no ordinary boy. For one thing, he was a dreamer, forever off in imagination. He could create almost anything out of practically nothing. And strangest of all, his best friend was an old woman. True, Mary Jane was a kindly, sweet old woman, but Billy's school friends thought her an odd choice. It was a school problem that Billy puzzled over now as he pushed open the gate to Mary Jane's garden. It was a trim little garden, crowded to overflowing with very friendly flowers, who seemed to nod welcome to all who entered. Bees hummed busily from blossom to blossom with thoughts of honey. Butterflies joined them in the air to add dashing bits of color. The most noticeable thing in the garden was the birds singing. Always their music filled the air. Mary Jane loved her birds and cared for them anxiously. Each had its own home. The red-breasted family of robins had a red castle in the apple tree. Nearby hung two other bird castles, one in emerald green and another painted silver. Billy's favorite was an odd house made in the shape of an ear of corn. It hung near a pumpkin house. Mary Jane called them her two vegetables. Other brightly colored houses peered through branches and vines at visitors. In them lived doves and wrens, sparrows, cardinals, and the occasional blue jay. Mary Jane often told Billy that her own family were her birds and his own little self. Today, the birds greeted Billy in their usual welcome of song, but he was much too distracted to notice. He looked about for Mary Jane with worry. "Mary Jane," he called. "I'm here," he heard her reply. His friend's gray head, wearing the little glasses she always seemed to look over instead of through, like this, popped out in the open near the arbor. "Why, hello, Billy," said Mary Jane. "Are you out of school early today?" "No, but I came straight here. They announced we're going to have a talent show, and I can't think of anything to do. You'll help me think of something, won't you?" Mary Jane got her serious look. She always took Billy seriously, unlike most grown-ups. It was one of the things that made her his best friend. She picked up her basket and the garden clippers, gathered a handful of clematis clippings that had scattered in the grass, and sat down on the stone bench thoughtfully. Drawing off her gloves, she settled her glasses a bit more comfortably and said, "I think you should do what you do best." "But that's just it," he groaned, dropping on the grass and tugging at a tuft. "I don't think I can do anything in front of people, like sing or recite or something. I'm for sure not going to dance like Carrie. She looks great, but she's a girl and I'd look like a dope. You paint lovely pictures." Billy made a face that anyone could see meant bad idea. "But you do, Billy. And just look how much our Oz birdhouses look like they're supposed to. I could never have done that without your help," said Mary Jane. Billy was quiet for a while. "Well, they were fun, but it's not like I could stand up on the stage and paint birdhouses. All the other kids are doing skits and stuff." A thought hit Mary Jane. You could always tell when that happened because she became instantly filled with energy. "I know just the thing. Follow me," she said, heading to the house. Billy followed her through the low door and up the stairs. It was a small house, and Billy knew it well. His favorite place was the window seat that looked out over the garden. It was in a bedroom Mary Jane had turned into her reading room. He'd practically grown up there, listening as her voice led him time and again through adventures in Oz. But today, to his surprise, they passed the reading room and kept going. The attic was their destination. Mary Jane's attic was filled with trunks and cases, boxes, and curious cartons. Their contents were the mementos of her childhood: ancient and out of season clothes, Christmas ornaments, all the typical attic things a woman her age would store. Mary Jane was digging through one of the bigger trunks now, piling on the floor an odd assortment of dolls and toys that fell over one another in a spilled jumble. She pulled out a few books and set them aside, saying to herself, "Why, these belong in the reading room." "What are we looking for?" asked Billy, kneeling beside her. "Why, your perfect talent. Isn't that what we were talking about?" It made no sense to Billy, so he just watched in curious silence. "Here he is," she said at last, straightening up. A puppet of a clown lay grinning at Billy. He seemed so old, Billy would have thought him an antique. His suit was red and white with a ruffled collar and a fuzzy red wig. The end of his nose was a round red ball, just like a clown's should be. Billy knew at once that his friend was right. He was perfect. But, wondered Billy, could a puppet become his talent? A moment passed before Mary Jane spoke again. "One puppet won't be enough for a whole show, but together you and I will make more. They'll be wonderful. I can show you how. My father made me this one when I was a child. And with your painting and my sewing, we can do a fine job for your talent show." "I've never worked a puppet. Is it hard?" "It can be, but you can do it if you practice." "I can practice," Billy said, but there was a shadow of concern in his voice. "But Mary Jane," he said as he examined the puppet, "I'll need some kind of story, something to have the puppets act out. For that, we're heading to the reading room. There's bound to be something." And with that, they did. Mary Jane pulled the Land of Oz from the shelf. "How about the scene with the Gump, the escape from the jackdaw's nest? Or perhaps we could work on something with the Patchwork Girl. She'd make a wonderful puppet." "But this is a clown. What can I do with a clown? Other than the one in the China country, I can't even remember any clowns in Oz," Billy frowned. "Or should I make different puppets from a real Oz story and just use him to learn how to make them work?" The Cowardly Lion of Oz came off the shelf. Mary Jane looked thoughtfully at the cover. Then, holding the book, she sat next to Billy in the window seat. A sort of faraway look crossed her face, and after a moment had passed, she said, "Billy, there is a story you could tell. One with the Patchwork Girl, Jack Pumpkinhead, the Scarecrow, and the Tin Woodman are there." Her voice trailed off, and she sat in silence. Billy, distracted until now with the continuing examination of the puppet he held, realized that something was wrong. Mary Jane seemed tired. "What story? Say, are you okay?" he asked. "It's just this." She paused. "Billy, I have this Oz story in my memory, but even rereading all the books to you, I've never found it. I don't know where it came from, but it's so real to me." She looked at Billy closely and shook her head. "They'll call me a foolish old woman." She paused and went on slowly. "I've never told anyone this before, but when I was a child, I knew Oz was real. I was part of a reading club, and we all had Oz pins to wear. I grew older, and the next thing I knew, they seemed to be just stories, not real at all, and I stopped believing. But now, lately, I seem to know stories I can't find in the books. I'll hear a certain laugh and think, 'Scarecrow,' as if I knew the sound of his voice. Or a fragrance in the garden will seem somehow Ozzy, and yet it's the same honeysuckle I smelled just the day before." Billy spoke softly. "Your garden's always been Ozzy to me, Mary Jane." She looked at him and sighed. "It's more than that, dear. It's a whole story about a garden in Oz where the flowers had no fragrance, the birds had no song, and I was there. Others were with me, and we had a dragon to fight." His eyes grew wide and his heart raced as her story began to unfold. Every detail grew clearer as she spoke, and he recognized much of the Oz garden in the garden just outside the window. Clearly, it had been her pattern. Poppies, bachelor buttons, snapdragons, roses, even the bees, butterflies, and birds, the bird bath, the arbor, all had been part of the story. When the story had ended, silence filled the room. Sun still shone through the window, but in the last hour, the world had changed. Billy had come to believe that Oz was real, and that somehow Mary Jane had been there, that her solitary life reflected a broken heart that longed to be in that magical place. So, young man, she said, giving herself an industrious shake, do you think we can put our heads together to make the puppets you'll need to make my story into a show for your class? Mary Jane, he answered in his most solemn tone, I'll make the best puppets you ever saw and practice harder than anything. Later that night, Billy's thoughts continued to dwell on Mary Jane and her Oz story. He was excited about the puppets. They had spent the rest of the afternoon in the attic, digging out things to use in making them. They had clothing and spare parts from several old dolls, lots of fabric, a funny little plastic Halloween pumpkin to use for Jack's head, and bits of old jewelry. It was a fine start, but it was the story that filled his thoughts. That and the thought that his own friend, Mary Jane, had actually visited Oz. Over the next 3 weeks, they worked together on the puppets whenever Billy was out of school. Mary Jane sewed eagerly, Billy painted carefully, and they both depended on lots of glue and string. They couldn't just make one standard body to duplicate, then dress it differently for each character. The citizens of Oz were far too extraordinary for that. The dragon was Billy's favorite. He had a long, fat body covered with purple sequins for scales, small wings about in his middle that Billy would have to work with strings, and eyes made from pretend jewels that he had carefully picked out of some costume jewelry. The scarecrow and Scraps were both sewn and stuffed, her dress made of a doll's quilt. The Tin Woodman was perhaps hardest because they had no real tin. They finally painted him from pieces of wood. They finally made him from pieces of wood and painted him silver. They found twigs in the garden to help with Jack, drawing loud protests from a jaybird who'd already spied those very same twigs for its own purposes. Ozma required the head of a china doll because nothing we'd make could ever reproduce that lovely face, according to Mary Jane. They worked in the reading room for the most part, occasionally going outside. It was on one of those outside afternoons that Billy asked a question that had been on his mind ever since Mary Jane had first told him about the garden. Whatever happened to your pin? He asked. What's that, dear? You said when you were my age you had an Oz pin from a reading club. What happened to it? My Ozmite pin, of course. Why, I'd forgotten all about it. Oh, I imagined it's up in the attic with all that old jewelry we went through the other day. What made you think of that? He shrugged. Just wondered. I'd have thought you'd have showed it to me by now, if you still had it. Remind me tomorrow and we'll look for it, she replied. As she said it, the robin in the red castle birdhouse burst into song, and a lone jaybird in a peculiar shade of green, who had been visiting the garden, took wing and rose quickly out of sight. That night, Billy surveyed the puppets. Most were now lined up in his bedroom at home. He was practicing evenings after supper, learning to make different voices and to work all the strings and sticks. He wasn't quite ready to work more than one puppet at a time, but he had 2 more weeks and he was getting better every day. Sitting down at his desk, he pulled a blank sheet of paper in front of him. His father had agreed to make a sort of stage, and now he needed to draw a picture of what he thought it would look like. With his eyes more on the clown puppet that now shared his desktop than on his paper, he began to draw. First, he drew a square with a border, then added curtains so it looked more like a stage. Not very fancy, he mumbled to himself. After all, this was an Oz show. He tried adding loopy fabric swishes across the top. Somehow it just wasn't working. Aimlessly, he turned the picture upside down, then sideways. He noticed that the curtains made his initial B. He began thinking about the bees, both those in Mary Jane's garden down the street and about those in the Oz garden. He couldn't make bee puppets, so he got by just making buzzing noises. Soon his stage plans were abandoned and he was drawing bumblebees instead. Then he tried turning his initials into bumblebees. By the time his mother was calling him to go to bed, he was trying to turn the bumblebee initials into a picture of a clown. The theater plans were completely abandoned, so he turned off the lights and headed out to brush his teeth. When he arrived at Mary Jane's the next afternoon, he had his clown with him. The puppet's little clown suit had been washed and mended, and he had a freshly painted face. Why, look at this, Mary Jane exclaimed admiringly. She reached out quickly, embracing her old friend, then studied him over the top of her glasses. You've really made a difference in old Bumble. Bumble? Asked Billy in surprise. Is that his name? Why didn't you tell me he had a name? Bless me if I didn't forget it myself until this very minute. He was just looking so like his old self. It was like I was a child again, came her response. But sure enough, his name is Bumble. I like it, replied Billy, picking a sun-warmed seat on the stone bench. You picked a good clown's name. He noted a puzzled look cross Mary Jane's face like a shadow, but she didn't explain it. Quickly enough, it was replaced with her cheerful smile. Help me with these wisteria vines, was all she said, and then we'll get to practicing with the puppets. The days passed quickly for Billy. His father finished the puppet stage and brought it over to Mary Jane's reading room for rehearsal. A few days before the school talent night, he performed the whole show there for a private audience of Mary Jane, his parents, and a bird or two that warbled away just outside the window seat. For the most part, all went well. He remembered the lines, his hands never showed, and the applause, for such a small audience, made him want to burst with pleasure. The only problem was Ozma's dress. The costume was too long in front and tended to tangle up at the worst times. That evening, with only one night to go until the real show, he was packing up the puppets with Mary Jane. What, he asked, can I do about Ozma's clothes? With all the beads and jewels you sewed around the bottom, I can't just cut it off. No, we can't do that, she said thoughtfully. Let me see what I can find to fix it. As she disappeared upstairs, Billy finished packing the puppets. He wrapped each one carefully in green tissue and laid it flat in the cardboard box. He daydreamed about how exciting it would be tomorrow on stage in front of the whole school. If they really like it, he thought, perhaps I'll make more puppets and figure out even more Oz stories. He began to disassemble the stage and to pack it carefully for the move to the school. Look what I found, called Mary Jane from the hall. She hurried into the room. Bits of paper, threads, and even a spare cobweb clung to her dress. Clearly, she'd been searching in the attic. Her glasses were missing, and her eyes sparkled like never before. She held out her hands towards Billy and uncurled her fingers. It was a silver pin, sort of like an airplane pilot would wear. An Oz logo was in the middle, and wings stretched out on either side of it. Billy knew it could only be one thing, the long-lost Ozmite pin. We can use it at Ozma's waist, Mary Jane said with obvious delight. It will be just the thing to pick up a little tuck in front without any fuss. It will fit right in and sort of make up for the magic belt not being part of the costume. Oh, Billy, she added, I'm so glad I found it for you. He fingered it gingerly. I've already packed up Ozma, he said with a sigh. She's clear down at the bottom of the box. Mary Jane's heart fell a bit, but her face didn't show it. Quickly, she grabbed a bit of green paper and wrapped it up. Don't you worry your own dear self about it for a minute, she said cheerfully. You can fix it yourself before the show tomorrow. It's 8:30, she added, looking at the clock. What time is your father picking up the boxes? 9, he replied. Excellent, said Mary Jane. We have one more box to pack. Billy's mouth fell open as she picked up an empty carton and began to pull her Oz books off the shelf. It's time I made these yours, she told him. One by one, she filled the box. Later that night, after Billy and his father had picked up the cartons, and she had stood firmly up to Mr. Harris's protest that the Oz books were much too expensive a gift and that she'd done far too much already, Mary Jane settled into her window seat and looked out over her dark garden. The fragrance remained, even though the sleeping birds were silent. She leaned back and sighed. Mary Jane? Came a soft, familiar voice. Startled, she turned from the window and met two blue eyes, one a bit larger than the other. Billy's parents looked worried at breakfast. They spoke to each other in whispers when Billy couldn't hear. Billy figured he wasn't supposed to notice, so he pretended not to. Say, son, asked his father at last, how about I drive you to school with all your stuff this morning instead of this evening? Sort of get it out of the way. Okay with you? Well, sure, Dad, I guess, he answered. They'll let me leave it backstage. Some other kids were leaving costumes and stuff even yesterday. They loaded the car. Billy grabbed a lunch sack and a kiss from his mother, his books and jacket from the front hall, and jumped in with his dad. Honk when we go by Mary Jane's for me, Dad. She'll be in the garden and told me to. No can do, son, Mr. Harris replied. I need to pick up my hat. Left it down the street the other direction at the Seabirds a couple days ago. I need it for the office. Billy looked longingly over his shoulder in the direction of his friend's house. She'd be disappointed. Oh, well, he sighed. She'll be there tonight, and that's what matters. Mr. Harris kept driving. The school day passed quickly. Everyone was eager for the last bell to ring. Then it was off to homes for fast dinners, then a return to the school to prepare for the show. Billy's mother had picked him up to save time, she said. She surprised him with a trip to a costume store where he got to pick out a present. He chose a green top hat that he could tip to the crowd after he took his bow. He knew when he saw it that Mary Jane would call it a true wizard's hat. The trip took them down the other side of the street, so again, he didn't get to drive by her little vine-covered house. When they arrived home, his father was already there with dinner waiting at the table. He'd fixed ribs and corn, finger food to loosen up those hands for the big show, he said. Then it was back in the car and off to pick up his grandparents. They were going to let all the families tour the school, see the kids' classwork, and meet their teachers while the students got prepared for their talent routines. Billy was backstage. He had his puppet theater all assembled before he began to worry. Not about the show. He was sure that would be a success, but about how Mary Jane would get to school. She didn't drive, and it was a long walk. He was wishing his dad would have offered to pick her up as he began to unpack the puppets. The puppets had traveled well. He carefully unrolled the green tissue until each Oz celebrity sat before him. Bumble, the dragon, Scarecrow, Tin Woodman, Jack Pumpkinhead, Scraps the Patchwork Girl, and Ozma made a remarkable display. Each had different sticks that made them work from below or strings that made them work from above. During the play, one or two could be moving at a time as the others appeared to pose around the puppet stage. By changing his voice and moving quickly from puppet to puppet, Billy would be able to lead them all through the story. He tucked a bit of loose straw into the Scarecrow and adjusted a tinny crown on Nick Chopper's head. When it was Ozma's turn, he unwrapped the Ozmite pin and looked at it again. Music was coming in from the auditorium now. Parents were being seated. He hoped Mary Jane had found his family and that they all had been able to sit together. As the band played the school song, Billy pulled Ozma into his lap and gathered up a fold in her gown and pinned the Ozmite pin at her waist where the magic belt belonged. Ozma's eyes turned to Billy, and her tiny painted mouth asked him sternly, "Are you a good giant or a bad giant?" He almost jumped in surprise. "Why, I'm Billy Harris," he answered, "and I'm not a giant at all." "Then I must be small," she replied thoughtfully, looking at her hands. "Did you intend to bring me here?" "Of course not, Your Majesty," exclaimed another voice. Speechless, Billy looked with wonder at his puppets. Somehow they were all alive. Bumble was speaking. "I can vouch for what happened. It was Mary Jane's pin. Remember the charm you placed on it when I left Oz to keep her company?" "Yes, but that was many years ago, and Mary Jane's back in Oz now. The Scarecrow brought him herself just the Scarecrow brought her himself just last night," replied the lovely ruler. "Back in Oz," Billy cried, much too loudly for someone who wanted to be left alone backstage. But no one was paying any attention to him. "But Ozma, it can only be that. Only your pin could bring me back, though Mary Jane hasn't used it for years. And here I am, and there is the pin," Bumble said, pointing to her slender waist where Mary Jane's Ozmite pin was fastened. Billy listened with amazement and wondered what to do. The Patchwork Girl was already dancing on the dragon's back as the Scarecrow dodged his smoky dragon breath. The Tin Woodman leaned thoughtfully on his axe. Jack had pulled his head off and was thumping at it with his knotty knuckles. "This isn't a pumpkin," he muttered. "You, young Billy," called the Tin Woodman, "what have you done to us? I feel much too lightweight, not even metallic. And how have I become so small?" "Yes, and I'd like to know why these strings seem to cling all over to me," chimed in the Patchwork Girl as they tangled around her feet and caused her to fall in a heap from the Scarecrow's back. 7 small faces turned to speechless Billy, expecting an answer. His words tumbled out. "I'm not sure what happened. I just know Mary Jane helped me make all of you as puppets for a show. It's talent night, you see, and Mary Jane told me an old Oz story about a garden. We turned it into a puppet show. Nick, you're made out of wood, painted to look like tin, and the strings and sticks and stuff are what make you work as puppets. And Jack, I'm real sorry, but we won't have real pumpkins for months, so we had to use a plastic one. Mary Jane didn't tell me anything about really bringing you here. Honest, Ozma, Your Majesty, I was just using the pin because I made your dress too long and we couldn't do the magic belt. And, well, I don't know what else other than that I'm real sorry." Billy ended in dismay, looking anxiously over his shoulder, trying to figure out how long he could stall until he'd be expected on stage. The audience was laughing at a skit. One song, and then it would be his turn. Ozma now had 3 concerns. When she first came to be backstage, getting back to Oz had been her only problem. Now it was clear that she had Billy to think about. He was obviously innocent of wrongdoing, and he was a friend of Mary Jane's, whom Ozma remembered. Plus, there was this puppet show business to somehow pull off. "When," she asked Lovely, "are you expected to be playing puppets with us?" "In a few minutes. Should I pretend I'm sick?" he volunteered. "I could put you all back in the box and get my dad to take you home." "You are not stuffing me in any old box," cried Scraps. "Scarecrow, think of something." The Scarecrow looked thoughtful. Well, he began, we could all pretend to be nothing more than puppets for a bit until the show's over. Just let Billy here work us like he'd planned. If he did that, I wouldn't have to think of a thing, and I could concentrate all my thoughts on getting us home. Home's easy, Bumble chimed in. Just unpin Ozma and you six are gone. I'm sure it'll work. Terrific charm, that one, he added to Ozma. I think we definitely should help Billy, Ozma said thoughtfully, but we mustn't just zip right back. Now that Mary Jane is gone, we need to determine what to do about Bumble. Tell me, Billy, this story that we're to play. Tell us, Billy, this story that we're to play. Since Cyrus the Silent is here, I assume it's about the enchanted garden of Sedge. Cyrus smiled as only a purple dragon can at the mention of his name. A low whistle escaped Billy. So it really is really real, he said, then repeated the story as Mary Jane had told it as quickly as he could. But I wasn't there, said a puzzled Ozma. Why did you make a puppet of me, too? Mary Jane didn't want people to think that she was a foolish old woman claiming it was a story she'd lived, so we made you to play her part. That's why we didn't make you with a wand or a magic belt or anything. She didn't have that stuff. And if it really had been you with all your powers, you'd have just fixed it without the adventure, Billy said. A reasonable explanation, if ever I've heard one, the Scarecrow volunteered. Jack, who had returned his head back to its person long ago, spoke again. I know I'm a bit forgetful, but didn't you say it was our turn after this song ended? At once, all present directed their attention to the stage, where the song in question was rapidly coming to a close. Quick, said Billy in alarm. It's almost time. If you're going to pretend to just be puppets and help with the show, you need to hide right here under the stage. His friends obligingly gathered their strings and sticks and miscellaneous puppet parts about them and hurried to climb up into the storage area behind the puppet stage. Scrap's shoe and the Tin Man's emperor crown were somehow lost in the shuffle, and Billy was still looking for them as he heard his teacher announce his name. Amid polite applause, Billy rolled his puppet theater onto the big auditorium stage. He took a bow, sweeping the green top hat practically to the floor, then stepped behind the theater. The Patchwork Girl's small bare foot was thrust out and wiggling in protest, so he quickly tucked it into her shoe. He palmed the crown with one hand to the Tin Woodman, who winked like a conspirator. His other hand was pressed firmly over Scrap's mouth. Despite Billy's nervousness at the sudden change in plans, the puppet show went well. Each player on the stage managed to avoid making too many involuntary moves that might give them away. Now that Billy knew what their voices really sounded like, he was better able to imitate them, so no one noticed when Jack inadvertently stepped on the Scarecrow and said, "Excuse me," or when the Tin Woodman dropped his axe and said, "Oh dear." Cyrus the Silent did have trouble keeping his smoky breath under control. Fortunately, the audience thought it was some kind of special effect. The children laughed and clapped over and over. Billy grinned and came forward again to take a deep bow. It had been a long story, and they cheered Billy for all his hard work. Stepping back behind the puppet theater, Billy quickly dropped the curtain. Bumble and Scraps continued to take bows and congratulate one another in the dark. Shh, he heard in Ozma's voice. Rolling the puppet theater ahead of himself, he didn't stop till he was as far backstage and away from others as he could get. Another student was on, and he wouldn't have to go back until the whole thing was over. He found a spot near a wall where they could talk and ran over to get the packing boxes. When he returned, Ozma was pacing thoughtfully as the others sat in respectful silence. Please quit thumping your tail, Cyrus dear, she said, stopping once. Someone is sure to hear you. Well, I'm open to suggestions. Getting around that charm I placed on the pin is a bit of a challenge, she said at last. Have you thought of a plan for us, Scarecrow? Your Majesty, he began solemnly, I have. But I'm afraid we may have to take a large number of people back to Oz. You see, it seems to me that it's unfair to Billy to make him stay here if we all get to return, and he'd no doubt be a fine addition as a citizen of Oz. But he has parents, grandparents, schoolmates. In fact, gathering from the applause, the entire community would miss him if he disappeared, so we'll simply have to take them all. Ozma could hardly believe that such a suggestion had been made. Billy, did you remember the pins and needles for the inside when you made the Scarecrow's head? She asked. I'm afraid he only worked on the outside of his head, Ozma, he replied. As I had guessed. Turning to the Scarecrow, she reached over to squeeze his hand and said soothingly, though I'd love to take Billy, we just don't have room for them all, Scarecrow. Can you think of anything else? I can, offered Bumble. Then speak up, be heard, said Jack. In this plastic seedless head, I certainly can't think at all. Bumble sighed. I've been thinking of it while we were reenacting the garden story. It's been a long time, a long, long time since I was last in Oz. I agreed to stay with the pin because, well, were it not for Mary Jane, old Cyrus here would have accidentally burned me to ashes long ago. And we had wonderful times together until she grew up. If the pin and I are separated, the charm will be broken and none of us will ever see Oz again. So I must continue to stay here. As long as the pin is safe with me, you can return to Oz. You set it up to transport only those who believe, and I'm responsible for it. Billy had been listening to Bumble and trying to put the remaining pieces of Mary Jane's story together. What happens to you then? He asked. Bumble met Billy's eyes with his own. As long as I stay with the pin, the one who owns it can make me be me anytime by wearing it or pinning it to my chest. The rest of the time, I'll be a simple puppet you believed me to be from the first. When we're home, Bumble, said Ozma softly, I can fix the charm. We can bring you back to Oz. You could, he replies, still looking at Billy, but I believe I belong here. This boy has entertaining in his blood. You heard those children in the audience. He has the makings of a wonderful clown. I'd like to stay and teach him. That is, he asked, if he'll have me. Billy tried to keep his eyes from filling with tears. Bumble, who could choose to go home to Oz, wanted to stay with him. His mind raced. They'd have wonderful adventures, and he'd learn to be a clown. Mary Jane would have been so pleased. It was too good to be true. What do you think, Billy? Asked Ozma. Can you guard the pin and take care of Bumble? If they were ever separated, the charm will be broken, she warned. He hesitated. Will it ever be like it was for Mary Jane? Will I forget you're all real? I can't promise you that won't happen, but I will promise this, Ozma said. Now that you're part of Oz, your actions will be regularly reported in Glinda's Book of Records, and I'll have birds from the Enchanted Garden of Sedge check in on you every year, like they did with Mary Jane. If I'm told that either you or Bumble ever needs us, or that the charm has worn off the pin, we'll come for you. I didn't know about the birds, said Billy. Are they all from Oz? No, replied Ozma with a smile, just the greenish jaybird. He saw that Mary Jane was remembering and that she gave you her books and the pin. It was he who told us that we needed to bring her and her garden back to Oz. You took her garden too? Billy asked in amazement. He realized now why his parents hadn't let him drive by her home that day. Somehow they must have known. You'll find nothing left where her house stood but emerald green grass, said the Scarecrow. When I came for her last night, she asked for it all. Sounds from the auditorium indicated that the talent show was soon to end. Time was running out. Are you sure about this, Bumble? Asked the Tin Woodman. If Billy had made me a puppet heart, I do believe I'd be unable to leave you here again. It was terribly hard the first time. I'm sure, Bumble replied, moving to be closer to Billy. Billy looked down at him anxiously and reached for his puppet hand. Then you need to take the pin off me, Billy, and put it in a safe place. Use it as often as you like to spend time with Bumble. But when I'm back, I'll have to change the charm a bit to be sure it doesn't continue to have the power to bring the rest of us too, Ozma said. Applause was coming from the audience. The show was over, and Billy had to join the other children on the stage. It was time to remove the pin. Ozma, he asked, will I ever see Mary Jane again? Ozma nodded and smiled. You never lose forever people that you love. He said his goodbyes quickly and stooped down to remove the pin from her waist. Quietly, she touched his cheek with her lips. With her kiss, she whispered a new charm so softly it was heard only by immortal ears. Please the children, Billy Bumble, she said, make them laugh. The end. So that is Billy Bumble of Oz. I realized reading it, what Bill Eubank used to do was take our initials and turn them into a clown face. He drew bumblebees out of everything too, but he had this little card and he'd have you drive your initials and he had his Billy Bumble info on it and you'd write your initials and he'd do things to it. And suddenly you had a clown face out of any initials that you'd give him. It was pretty incredible. I can't think what else I saw reading through it that reminded me of Bill Eubank. He did have a green top hat. That was something else I pulled out of my real knowledge of our dear Bill Eubank. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the story. That was it. Oziana, 1994. As we continue to read you stories every week from the International Wizard of Oz Club's member fiction publication series, I hope you will continue to tune in and listen to more of them. Thank you all. Bye-bye.